when the first German prisoners of war arrived on American soil in 1943. Neither the prisoners nor many Americans could have predicted what would unfold behind the barbed wire fences of detention camps across the United States. What emerged was one of the most extensive educational programs ever implemented for enemy combatants, a system that would ultimately serve over 425,000 Axis prisoners with academic coursework, vocational training, and cultural enrichment that rivaled many civilian educational institutions of the era. This remarkable story involves the coordination of multiple organizations and institutions: the U.S. War Department, which administered the camps; the YMCA's War Prisoners Aid program, which provided resources and personnel; American universities, which extended their educational services beyond traditional boundaries; and the prisoners themselves, who seized unprecedented opportunities for intellectual growth during their captivity. Together, they created an educational infrastructure that would influence post-war Reconstruction, international humanitarian standards, and our understanding of education's role in conflict resolution. The massive influx of prisoners began in earnest following the surrender of German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps in Tunisia in May 1943. Just a year and a half after the attack on Pearl Harbor, more than 150,000 German prisoners poured in after the surrender of the Afrika Korps in the spring of 1943. After that, an average of 20,000 POWs arrived each month, and following the Normandy invasion of June 1944, the numbers soared to 30,000 per month. The scale was unprecedented. During the last months of the war, prisoners poured in at the astonishing rate of 60,000 per month. By the end of the war, the United States found itself holding more than 425,000 prisoners of war, 372,000 Germans, 53,000 Italians, and 5,000 Japanese. The United States had never faced such a challenge. There was no existing infrastructure, no established protocols for managing such numbers, and considerable uncertainty about how to house, feed, and occupy hundreds of thousands of young men who would remain in American custody for months or years. The solution required rapid mobilization of resources across the country. The War Department moved fast and, together with the Corps of Engineers, began scouring the country for temporary campsites. Camps were established in nearly every state, with particular concentrations in the South and West, where climate, available land, and labor needs made prisoner detention practical. Texas alone would host approximately 90,000 prisoners across dozens of camps. But housing and feeding prisoners was only the beginning. International law, specifically the 1929 Geneva Convention, required humane treatment and prohibited idleness among prisoners. The convention encouraged intellectual stimulation and meaningful activity. American authorities faced a practical question: how do you constructively occupy hundreds of thousands of young men, many of whom would remain in custody for years? The answer would involve transforming detention camps into educational institutions. The Young Men's Christian Association had a long history of supporting military personnel and prisoners of war. During World War I, the YMCA had provided extensive services to both Allied troops and prisoners in camps across Europe. This experience positioned the organization uniquely to respond when World War II created massive new prisoner populations. During WWII, the War Prisoners Aid program involved POW camps in 33 countries and included supplies sent to 20 other nations where conditions precluded personal visits by YMCA War Prisoner Aid staff. The scope was truly global. More than 250 YMCA secretaries visited camps in 38 countries, bringing not just material supplies, but expertise in organizing educational and recreational programs that would maintain prisoners' mental health and prepare them for eventual return to civilian life. The YMCA's approach was grounded in humanitarian principles, but also reflected practical understanding of prison dynamics. Idle prisoners were unhappy prisoners, prone to escape attempts, disciplinary problems, and depression. Meaningful activity, particularly education, provided both humanitarian benefit and institutional stability. The YMCA had learned during World War I that educational programs reduced tensions, improved morale, and created constructive frameworks for the long periods of confinement that prisoners endured. The organization's infrastructure was substantial. The YMCA operated through its War Prisoners Aid Division, which coordinated with military authorities, sourced educational materials, recruited qualified personnel, and ensured consistent programming across the camp network. Radios and phonographs, donated by the YMCA or purchased by the prisoners themselves, could be found in every camp, representing just one example of the organization's material contributions. Beyond physical resources, the YMCA provided the organizational expertise that made educational programs functional. YMCA representatives visited camps regularly, assessed needs, facilitated connections between camps and external educational resources, and ensured that Geneva Convention requirements for prisoner welfare were met. A Swedish attorney, Henry Soderberg, known to the Kriegis as the Welcome Swede, visited camps every 2 to 3 months as a representative of the YMCA, bringing books, supplies, and equipment to enable the men to have a variety of recreational programs. By 1944, a comprehensive educational system had emerged across the American POW camp network. Each major camp established camp colleges, and prisoners could enroll in a wide variety of courses, including history, mathematics, the sciences, vocational courses, and preparatory classes for students seeking post-war careers in medicine, law, electrical engineering, and architecture. These weren't token programs designed merely to satisfy Geneva Convention requirements. They were serious academic institutions offering rigorous coursework taught by qualified instructors. The teaching staff consisted primarily of prisoners themselves. Many German POWs had been university students, professionals, or educators before conscription. This created an unusual situation where expertise existed within the prisoner population itself, requiring only organization and resources to activate educational potential. The participation rates demonstrated genuine prisoner interest in educational opportunities. At Camp Opelika, which held 3,000 prisoners, some 1,400 participated in coursework, nearly half the camp population. This wasn't exceptional. Every camp had an impressive selection of POW-taught courses, ranging from English to engineering, and enrollment was consistently high across the camp system. The curriculum structure varied by camp, but generally included several categories of offerings. Academic courses provided instruction in traditional subjects, mathematics, sciences, history, literature, and languages. Professional preparatory courses helped prisoners prepare for specific post-war careers, with tracks in medicine, law, engineering, and architecture being particularly popular. Vocational courses taught practical trades and skills. And general education courses provided basic literacy and numeracy instruction for prisoners with limited prior schooling. Camps offered Human Prep, in which high school and college-level courses were taught by the prisoners, along with a 3,000-book library. The use of prep in the naming reflected the serious academic nature of these programs. They weren't casual adult education classes, but rather structured courses designed to prepare students for recognized examinations and credentials. The physical infrastructure for education varied by camp. Some established dedicated classroom buildings. Others adapted existing structures, mess halls, recreation buildings, or even barracks for educational use. Regardless of physical limitations, camps created spaces where learning could occur. Areas with chalkboards, seating arrangements conducive to instruction, and some degree of quiet for study. The daily schedule had to accommodate both labor requirements and educational activities. Reveille was at 5:45 a.m., and lights were turned off at 10:00 p.m. Between those times, the prisoners worked, took care of their own needs, and entertained themselves with a large variety of handicraft and educational programs. Many prisoners attended classes in the evenings after completing work assignments. Others, depending on work schedules and camp policies, might attend during daytime hours. The system required flexibility to accommodate the competing demands on prisoners' time. The evolution of POW education programs represented a significant milestone when American universities began offering correspondence courses to prisoners. Initially, prisoners taught the courses. Later, prisoners were permitted to enroll in correspondence courses from the University of Michigan and the University of Wisconsin. This development transformed camp education from internal programs to externally validated academic work. Prisoners weren't just learning from fellow prisoners. They were enrolling in actual university courses that carried academic credit and would be recognized beyond the camp context. The implications were substantial. A prisoner who completed a correspondence course in engineering from the University of Wisconsin wasn't just occupying his time constructively. He was earning credentials that would be recognized by German universities and employers after repatriation. The administrative coordination required for these programs was considerable. Army officials even contacted the University of Alabama and the Alabama Polytechnic Institute, now Auburn University, to discuss offering courses to the prisoners. These discussions involved multiple stakeholders: military authorities who administered the camps, university administrators who would provide the courses, YMCA representatives who helped coordinate logistics, and German prisoners who would enroll as students. Some prisoners even took correspondence courses through local colleges and universities, and their academic credits were accepted by the Germans upon their return. This international recognition was crucial. German educational authorities acknowledged that coursework completed through American universities met their academic standards. This meant prisoners could continue interrupted educational paths, complete degree requirements, or begin new areas of study without losing time or having to repeat coursework after repatriation. The correspondence course system worked through established educational frameworks. Universities prepared course materials, examinations, and assignments. These materials were shipped to camps where enrolled prisoners completed the work. Assignments were returned to universities for grading by faculty. Progress reports tracked student advancement through courses. Upon successful completion, universities issued transcripts and certificates that prisoners could take home. The range of available courses was substantial. Universities offered instruction in languages, mathematics, sciences, humanities, social sciences, and professional fields. Prisoners could study English literature, advanced mathematics, chemistry, history, economics, and numerous other subjects. The breadth of offerings meant that prisoners with diverse interests and career goals could find relevant coursework. The most popular course was English. Some individuals also studied Hebrew, mathematics, and chemistry. The overwhelming popularity of English instruction reflected multiple motivations. Practically, English skills facilitated daily interactions with American guards and camp personnel. More broadly, English proficiency offered post-war career advantages in an increasingly interconnected world, where English was becoming the language of international commerce and diplomacy. English classes varied by level and purpose. Beginning courses taught basic vocabulary, grammar, and conversation skills. Intermediate courses developed reading comprehension and writing abilities. Advanced courses explored literature, composition, and specialized vocabulary for professional contexts. Some prisoners studied English intensively, spending hours daily on language acquisition. Teaching methods combined formal instruction with immersive practice. Classroom lessons provided structured grammar and vocabulary instruction. Prisoners were permitted to maintain subscriptions to American newspapers, magazines, and a New York-based German language paper called the New Deutsche Volkszeitung, which provided reading practice. Interactions with American personnel offered conversational practice. Some camps organized English language discussion groups where prisoners practiced speaking. The motivation for language study extended beyond practical communication. For many prisoners, learning English represented intellectual curiosity about American culture and society. English opened access to American literature, journalism, and ideas. It provided windows into the democratic society they were experiencing indirectly through captivity. Some prisoners hoped to emigrate to America after the war. Others anticipated business or academic connections that would require English proficiency. Beyond English, other language offerings reflected prisoners' diverse backgrounds and interests. Some studied Hebrew, perhaps reflecting Jewish prisoners' desire to connect with religious heritage or anticipating post-war emigration to Palestine. Other camps offered instruction in Spanish, French, or other languages depending on available teaching expertise and student interest. Academic coursework represented one dimension of POW education, but vocational training addressed equally important needs. Germany would emerge from the war with massive Reconstruction requirements. Cities lay in ruins, industrial infrastructure was destroyed, and millions of displaced people needed housing, employment, and services. The skilled workers who could rebuild would be crucial to recovery. American and Allied authorities recognized that vocational training served multiple purposes. Humanely, it gave prisoners marketable skills that would help them support themselves and their families after repatriation. Strategically, it helped ensure Germany would have the skilled workforce necessary for Reconstruction and economic recovery. Politically, it demonstrated democratic society's commitment to helping even former enemies rebuild their lives. Educational programs were prevalent, offering courses in English and various trades, preparing prisoners for life after repatriation. The vocational curriculum included carpentry, metalworking, electrical work, plumbing, masonry, automotive repair, agricultural techniques, and numerous other skilled trades. Instruction combined classroom learning about tools, materials, and techniques with hands-on practice that developed actual competency. The work assignments that prisoners performed as part of their labor obligations sometimes complemented vocational training. Prisoners working in agricultural settings could apply farming techniques learned in classes. Those working in construction gained practical experience with tools and methods covered in vocational courses. The combination of formal instruction and applied practice provided more comprehensive preparation than either component alone. In Britain, around 1,000 prisoners were trained as primary school teachers, coached to pass university entrance exams, or given basic theological training. While American programs focused less on teacher training, they shared the recognition that post-war Germany would need not just manual laborers, but also educators, clergy, and professionals who could rebuild social institutions. Some vocational programs prepared prisoners for emerging technologies and industries. Courses in electrical engineering and electronics anticipated the increasing importance of these fields in post-war economy. Radio repair and maintenance training recognized broadcasting's role in modern communication. Automotive courses prepared mechanics for motorized transportation's expansion. The quality of vocational instruction varied by camp and available expertise. Some camps had highly qualified trade instructors among the prisoner population, master craftsmen who could provide expert-level training. Others relied on more basic instruction supplemented by correspondence materials or visits from civilian trade educators. The YMCA helped coordinate access to vocational training materials, tools, and equipment that made practical instruction possible. Almost every camp maintained a library of donated books and magazines, some large enough to do justice to an average high school. Camp Fannin, for example, maintained a well-stocked library of over 2,500 books with an 80% circulation rate. These libraries represented the foundation of educational programs, providing resources for both formal coursework and independent learning. The circulation rates indicated genuine prisoner engagement with reading materials. An 80% circulation rate at Camp Fannin meant that prisoners were actively checking out books, reading them, and returning them for others, a level of library use that would be enviable in many civilian communities. Some camps had 3,000 book libraries, representing substantial collections that covered diverse subjects and interests. The YMCA played a central role in building these library collections. YMCA representatives brought books, supplies, and equipment to enable prisoners to have recreational programs during regular camp visits. The organization solicited book donations, purchased materials, and coordinated distribution across the camp network. The Fort Riley Base Camp sent out 20 books for the POWs at Lake Wabansie to read. Many POWs also had their own books. Library collections included multiple categories of materials. Academic books supported formal coursework in mathematics, sciences, languages, and humanities. Technical manuals assisted vocational training. Classic and contemporary literature provided entertainment and cultural education. Reference works, dictionaries, encyclopedias, atlases supported research and learning. Magazines and periodicals offered current information and diverse reading experiences. The presence of German language materials alongside English language books served multiple purposes. For prisoners with limited English proficiency, German materials remained accessible. For language learners, having parallel texts in both languages facilitated translation and comprehension. German classics and contemporary works maintained prisoners' connection to their own literary culture, while exposure to American and English literature broadened cultural understanding. Beyond print materials, radios and phonographs, donated by the YMCA or purchased by the prisoners themselves, could be found in every camp. These audio resources complemented print libraries. Radio broadcasts provided news, entertainment, and language learning opportunities. Recorded music offered cultural connection and recreation. Some camps used phonograph recordings to supplement language instruction or provide lecture content. The library spaces themselves varied by camp. Some established dedicated library buildings with reading rooms, catalog systems, and designated librarian staff from among the prisoners. Others integrated library materials into recreation halls or other multipurpose spaces. Regardless of physical arrangement, libraries became intellectual centers within camps, places where prisoners could engage with ideas, pursue learning, and temporarily escape the confines of captivity through books. Washington generally encouraged authorized publication of mimeographed German-language POW newspapers in many camps, most quite sophisticated, with in-depth articles, soccer scores, and even classified ads. These publications served multiple functions within the educational and cultural ecosystem of POW camps. From a prisoner perspective, newspapers provided outlets for expression, creativity, and communication. Prisoners could write articles, share perspectives, debate ideas, and participate in something resembling normal civic discourse. For many young German men who had only known Nazi totalitarianism, this represented their first experience with press freedom and open discussion. Washington generally encouraged these newspapers for two reasons. The German prisoners experienced freedom, many for the first time in their young lives, and at the same time, the American authorities could gauge mood in a given camp by monitoring these weekly newspapers. This dual purpose reflected sophisticated understanding of how media freedom served both humanitarian and security interests. The sophistication of these publications varied, but often exceeded expectations. The Kreeges published a monthly, single-page newspaper, the Auflage 64 item, which was printed by Anna Krix, the wife of Willy Krix, who had owned a printing plant before being conscripted into the German army. The involvement of professional printers and journalists among prisoner populations meant some camp newspapers achieved quality comparable to civilian publications. Content typically included news about camp activities and policies, announcements of educational course offerings, sports results and schedules, cultural event reviews, opinion pieces on various topics, classified advertisements, and creative writing including poetry and short fiction. The specific mix varied by camp and editorial direction, but publications generally aimed to inform, entertain, and provide forums for prisoner expression. Most camps were permitted to maintain subscriptions to American newspapers, magazines, and a New York-based German-language paper called the New Deutsche Volkszeitung. Access to external publications meant prisoners weren't limited to camp-produced media. They could follow news, engage with diverse perspectives, and maintain awareness of events beyond barbed wire. The educational value of newspapers was substantial. For language learners, newspapers provided authentic reading practice with current vocabulary and idioms. For those studying American culture and politics, newspapers offered primary sources for understanding democratic society. For everyone, newspapers maintained cognitive engagement and intellectual stimulation that helped prevent the mental deterioration that prolonged captivity could cause. Education in POW camps extended beyond formal coursework into broader cultural and recreational programming that educated through experience and participation. Every camp had a POW orchestra, a theater group, and a soccer team. These activities provided more than entertainment. They offered opportunities for learning, skill development, and cultural expression. Musical programs required organization, practice, and performance skills. Prisoners had a jazz band and a classical orchestra, with instruments provided by the YMCA. Prisoners who had musical training could maintain their skills while teaching others. Those learning instruments for the first time gained new abilities. Ensemble performance taught collaboration, discipline, and artistic expression. Concerts provided cultural events that enriched camp life while showcasing prisoners' talents. Theater programs engaged prisoners in all aspects of theatrical production. Camp theaters produced shows, comedies were quite popular, and even printed tickets and playbills outlining the casts. Prisoners wrote scripts, designed sets, created costumes, acted, directed, and managed productions. Theater activities taught communication skills, creativity, project management, and teamwork while providing entertainment for camp audiences. Sports programs offered physical activity along with lessons in fair play, teamwork, and athletic skill. Soccer was particularly popular given German cultural affinity for the sport. Every camp had soccer teams organized into leagues with regular matches, standings, and championship competitions. Baseball, introduced by American guards, gave prisoners exposure to American sports culture. Other athletic activities included track and field, boxing, and various recreational games. Religious programming served spiritual needs while also providing moral education and community gathering opportunities. A parish priest from Eskridge conducted religious services for the prisoners. These services maintained religious practice, offered pastoral counseling, and provided context for ethical reflection about war, responsibility, and rebuilding lives after conflict. Handicraft activities combined recreation with vocational skill development. Prisoners created wood carvings, leather goods, artwork, and various crafts using available materials. These activities taught manual dexterity, attention to detail, and creative expression while producing items prisoners could keep as mementos or give as gifts. Some prisoners' craft work achieved considerable sophistication, demonstrating artistic talent developed or refined during captivity. As the war progressed and Allied victory became certain, educational programming increasingly incorporated re-education components designed to introduce prisoners to democratic values and challenge Nazi indoctrination. At the end of the war, the prisoners were sent back to Germany, but not without being educated in U.S. history, English, geography, and the benefits of democracy and capitalism. These programs represented delicate balancing acts between education and propaganda. American authorities wanted to prepare prisoners to become supporters of democratic government in post-war Germany without resorting to heavy-handed indoctrination techniques that would be hypocritical in democratic societies, claiming moral superiority over totalitarian systems. The approach emphasized factual information, open discussion, and experiential learning rather than forced acceptance of prescribed beliefs. Core components of re-education included instruction in American history, government, and democratic principles. Courses explained constitutional structures, civil liberties, separation of powers, and federalism. Prisoners learned about democratic institutions, legislatures, independent courts, free press, voluntary associations, and how they function to protect individual rights while enabling collective governance. Economic education introduced capitalist principles and market economies. Courses explained private property, competition, entrepreneurship, and consumer choice. Prisoners learned about labor unions, business organization, banking systems, and economic regulations. The goal was demonstrating how free market economies could generate prosperity and opportunity while avoiding the command economy failures of both fascism and communism. Comparative studies contrasted democratic and totalitarian systems. Without demonizing prisoners or their nation, instructors could examine differences between societies with rule of law versus arbitrary power, free speech versus controlled media, independent courts versus political justice, and voluntary participation versus coerced compliance. These comparisons allowed prisoners to reflect on their own experiences under Nazi rule. Documentary evidence became controversial but important components of re-education. Prisoners were shown footage and photographs from concentration camp liberations, confronted with evidence of crimes committed in their nation's name. These presentations provoked intense reactions: shock, denial, anger, guilt, but forced reckonings with realities many prisoners had not known or had avoided acknowledging. The discovery of Holocaust atrocities fundamentally changed the moral context of the entire war and raised difficult questions about collective responsibility. Following Germany's defeat and the discovery of the atrocities of the Holocaust, American military officials feared the presence of Nazis among the college instructors and took control of the camp colleges. This administrative shift reflected concerns that committed Nazis might use teaching positions to continue indoctrination rather than facilitate genuine education. American authorities began screening instructors and monitoring course content more carefully. The effectiveness of re-education programs remains debated by historians. Some prisoners embraced democratic ideas and returned to Germany as advocates for democracy. Others remained resistant or cynical about American efforts. Many fell somewhere between, receptive to some ideas while skeptical of others. The long-term impact on post-war German political culture is difficult to isolate from other factors, but exposure to democratic values and practices likely contributed to West Germany's successful democratic development. Educational programs weren't without complications and opposition. Some Alabama residents resented what they perceived as the POWs' pampering while they endured rationing. This resentment reflected genuine tensions. Geneva Convention requirements meant POWs sometimes received treatment that seemed generous compared to what rationing-constrained American civilians experienced. The food situation illustrated these tensions. At one point, the prisoners at Camp Brady received 12,000 cards, letters, and parcels in a single week. Red Cross packages supplemented camp rations, and camps generally provided adequate nutrition. Meanwhile, American civilians faced meat rationing, sugar restrictions, and shortages of various goods. The perception that enemy prisoners ate better than American families created understandable resentment. Educational resources raised similar concerns. Books, correspondence course fees, educational materials, and instructor time all represented expenses and resources. In a nation mobilizing every resource for war, dedicating materials to educating enemy prisoners struck some Americans as misguided priority. Why invest in enemy education when American students faced teacher shortages and resource constraints due to the war? Military authorities and program advocates had responses to these concerns. International law required humane treatment and prohibited prisoner idleness. Educational programs served strategic interests by preparing prisoners to rebuild democratic Germany after the war. Occupied prisoners were more compliant prisoners, reducing escape attempts and disciplinary problems. The relatively modest costs of education prevented much larger costs that would result from prisoner unrest or post-war instability in Germany. But public opinion wasn't always swayed by strategic arguments. Families who had lost sons in combat sometimes questioned why those who had killed American soldiers deserved educational opportunities. Newspaper editorials occasionally criticized coddling of prisoners. Local communities hosting camps sometimes expressed frustration with the prisoner presence and the resources devoted to their care. Within camps, challenges included maintaining educational quality with limited resources, managing ideological divisions among prisoners that sometimes erupted in violence, preventing Nazi prisoners from intimidating those who cooperated with American authorities, and balancing work requirements with educational programming. The discovery of concentration camp atrocities particularly complicated prisoner dynamics, as hardcore Nazis denied or minimized the evidence while others experienced genuine horror and shame. Administrative challenges included coordinating correspondence courses across geographic distances, maintaining library materials as books wore out, recruiting qualified instructors from prisoner populations, preventing educational programs from being used to pass intelligence or plan escapes, and managing the logistics of moving prisoners between work sites and educational activities. Behind the statistics and program descriptions were individual prisoners whose lives were shaped by educational opportunities during captivity. One prisoner joked, "I was originally from Czechoslovakia, where I was drafted into the German army. The army sent me to Italy and then to North Africa, where I was captured. I was sent to Liverpool, England, before being shipped to New York. At New York, I was put on a train and eventually ended up at the Lake Wabansie. It was a trip only a rich man or a prisoner could take." This dark humor captured the surreal quality of the POW experience, captivity that provided opportunities many couldn't have afforded in freedom. For working-class young men conscripted into military service, university courses had been beyond reach. Now, as prisoners, they could study engineering, medicine, or law through correspondence programs with prestigious American universities. Apparently, the majority of German prisoners who spent the war years in Texas remembered their experience as one of the greatest adventures of their lives. This remarkable statement reflects how educational and cultural opportunities transformed captivity from mere detention into a formative life experience. Prisoners who arrived expecting hardship instead found libraries, classrooms, orchestras, theaters, and sports leagues. Personal relationships developed that transcended the captor-captive dynamic. POWs and Wabansie County farmers often developed friendly relations, even though they had to overcome cultural and language barriers. The POWs' hard work and personal qualities won over many Americans. English language skills learned in camp facilitated these connections, allowing prisoners and Americans to communicate, share experiences, and sometimes form lasting friendships. Americans were impressed by the POWs' love of children, noting incidents where prisoners showed kindness and generosity toward local children. These small human interactions helped break down stereotypes and prejudices on both sides. Americans saw German prisoners as individual human beings rather than faceless enemies. Prisoners experienced American kindness and hospitality that contradicted Nazi propaganda about American society. Some prisoners maintained connections after repatriation. When Roger Schwalm visited Ernst Kunzel in Germany after the war, Kunzel joked that he should have a candy bar for Schwalm, referencing American treats prisoners had enjoyed and shared. These post-war visits demonstrated that educational and cultural exchanges during captivity could create bonds that survived the war's end. For many prisoners, captivity provided their first exposure to democratic society and freedom of thought. Washington encouraged POW newspapers because German prisoners experienced freedom, many for the first time in their young lives. This freedom to read uncensored materials, discuss ideas openly, and question authority represented profound experiences for young men raised under Nazi totalitarianism. Educational achievements during captivity opened post-war opportunities. Prisoners who earned university credits or vocational certifications returned to Germany with credentials that advanced careers. Those who learned English found employment opportunities in international business, translation, or emigration to English-speaking countries. Technical skills gained through vocational training helped prisoners support families during difficult post-war years. The American POW educational system existed within a broader international context of prisoner treatment during World War II. In Britain, large-scale education programs for prisoners of war saw around 1,000 prisoners trained as primary school teachers, coached to pass university entrance exams, or given basic theological training. British programs shared American commitments to education, but operated on smaller scales with different emphases. Soviet treatment of German POWs differed dramatically. Soviet camps focused on harsh labor with minimal food, extensive political indoctrination attempting to create communist converts, and virtually no educational programming beyond political lectures. Mortality rates in Soviet camps were high, and prisoners often remained in captivity for years beyond the war's end. Japanese treatment of Allied POWs was even worse, with systematic brutality, starvation rations, forced labor on dangerous projects, and complete absence of educational or recreational programming. Allied prisoners in Japanese camps focused on basic survival rather than intellectual development. The American approach, with its emphasis on education, humane treatment, and preparation for post-war life, reflected both Geneva Convention compliance and deeper values about human dignity and democracy's confidence in its own appeal. By treating prisoners humanely and exposing them to democratic values through experience rather than coercion, American authorities demonstrated belief that freedom and democracy would prove inherently attractive. Most prisoners balanced educational pursuits with work assignments. The nation's young men had gone overseas, so the War Department authorized a major program to allow labor-starved farmers to utilize the POWs. Prisoners worked in agriculture, forestry, food processing, and various industries experiencing labor shortages due to military mobilization. This labor program intersected with education in complex ways. Work provided practical experience that could complement vocational training. Agricultural workers could apply scientific farming techniques learned in classes. Those working in construction used skills from trade courses. Some prisoners gained work experience that informed their post-war career choices. Local farmers could pay a fee to the camp to rent out prison labor, with prisoners working under minimal or no guard supervision. These work arrangements required trust on both sides and often facilitated cultural exchange. Farmers saw prisoners' work ethic and character. Prisoners experienced American rural life and hospitality. Language skills from camp classes enabled communication that made work more efficient and relationships more meaningful. The daily schedule required balancing competing demands. Between reveille at 5:45 a.m. and lights out at 10:00 p.m., prisoners worked, took care of their own needs, and entertained themselves with educational programs. Evening classes allowed prisoners who worked during the day to pursue education. Some camps adjusted schedules to enable daytime education for certain prisoners. The system demonstrated flexibility in accommodating both labor requirements and educational goals. Compensation for work created resources prisoners could use for educational purposes. Prisoners were paid 80 cents per day, which could be used to purchase merchandise at the camp store or placed in a trust fund available to them after the war. Some prisoners used earnings to buy books, correspondence course materials, or other educational resources not provided by the camp or YMCA. The educational program's full impact emerged in post-war years. By November 1945, the former POWs were returned to Europe at the rate of $50,000 a month, though most were used to help rebuild war-damaged France and Britain before their ultimate return to Germany. These returning prisoners brought skills, knowledge, and experiences that influenced post-war German Reconstruction and political development. Prisoners who had received vocational training found employment in rebuilding infrastructure, housing, and industry. Those with academic credentials pursued or resumed university education and professional careers. English speakers found opportunities in international business, translation, or positions requiring foreign language skills. The aggregate effect of hundreds of thousands of prisoners returning with enhanced education and skills contributed to Germany's recovery. Political impacts are harder to measure but likely significant. Prisoners who had experienced democratic society, even as captives, returned with different perspectives than those who hadn't. Exposure to free press, open discussion, and democratic governance provided reference points for evaluating political systems. While not all prisoners became democracy advocates, the collective experience of American captivity likely contributed to West Germany's democratic development. The educational programs established precedents for future conflicts. International humanitarian law continued developing standards for prisoner treatment, incorporating lessons from WWII experiences. The Geneva Conventions were revised and expanded after the war, codifying principles about prisoner welfare that American practices had exemplified. The YMCA's role in POW education influenced its subsequent military support activities. The organization's experience managing large-scale educational and recreational programs informed its work with military personnel in Korea, Vietnam, and later conflicts. The model of civilian organizations partnering with military authorities to provide services became institutionalized through organizations like the USO. For American universities, participation in POW education demonstrated possibilities for international educational outreach. After the war, American universities expanded international programs, foreign student enrollment, and educational development assistance. The experience of successfully providing correspondence education to German POWs showed that geographic and political barriers could be overcome when institutions committed to educational access. The story of college and vocational classes for POWs in U.S. camps through YMCA and university programs represents a remarkable chapter in educational and military history. These programs transformed detention facilities into learning environments that served hundreds of thousands of prisoners with academic coursework, vocational training, and cultural enrichment rivaling many civilian institutions. The success measured not just in course enrollments, degrees earned, or skills acquired, but in the broader demonstration that even amid wartime hostilities, humanitarian impulses and strategic foresight could combine productively. The prisoners gained knowledge and skills that aided post-war lives. America demonstrated democratic values while preparing former enemies to become participants in rebuilding stable, democratic Germany. The infrastructure built by the YMCA and university partners, libraries, correspondence systems, instructional programs, and cultural activities, represented more than temporary wartime expedients. They embodied principles about education's universal importance and human potential for growth, even in unlikely circumstances. The willingness to invest resources in educating enemy prisoners reflected confidence that education and exposure to democratic values would prove more effective than coercion in building lasting peace. The programs weren't perfect. Public resentment of resources devoted to prisoners was understandable. The discovery of Holocaust atrocities raised difficult questions about how to educate members of a regime that committed such crimes. Some prisoners remained committed Nazis despite educational efforts. But the overall achievement, creating functional educational systems serving hundreds of thousands of prisoners across hundreds of camps, demonstrated organizational capacity and humanitarian commitment that distinguished American prisoner treatment. For the prisoners themselves, These educational opportunities represented unexpected possibilities during captivity. Young men who had known only totalitarian control experienced intellectual freedom. Those from working-class backgrounds accessed university education they couldn't have afforded. Professionals interrupted by war continued developing skills. The aggregate effect enriched hundreds of thousands of individual lives while contributing to post-war recovery and reconciliation. The legacy endures in multiple ways. International humanitarian law continues evolving based partly on lessons from WWII prisoner treatment. Educational institutions maintain commitments to access that transcend political boundaries. Organizations like the YMCA continue providing educational and recreational programming in military contexts. And the historical record demonstrates that even in war's midst, education can serve both humanitarian values and strategic interests in building lasting peace.